On the eve of the Reformation, religious life in England, 1450-1530. England was still, of course, a Catholic country. In a way, I don't like to use the word Roman Catholic because that belongs, I think, to the post-Reformation period, the Roman Catholic Church versus the Protestants, i.e. it belongs to 100 years later. I prefer to say it was part of the Universal Latin Church of Western Europe of the Middle Ages. The first thing to notice about this church, as in England as elsewhere, was its great wealth and power. Not peculiar to England, but we are focusing on England, far wealthier and more powerful than the churches today. It also had a monopoly. You couldn't pick and choose your churches, officially. And a far higher proportion of the population than today were professionally connected with it. In fact, the church forms an alternative or complementary stratified society to lay society. The higher clergy were the equivalent of the nobles and gentry, say the two archbishops equivalent of dukes, bishops equivalent of barons, canons and deans equivalent of gentry, and so on. The main thing to notice about the higher clergy is they spent most of their time, most of them, not doing clerical things at all, but being civil servants and ministers to the king. A good example of that in the 14th century, a bit earlier, is William of Wykeham, who was Edward III's Lord Chancellor and founded New College, then his imitator in exactly our period, William of Waynflete, his namesake. They were both Bishop of Winchester, who founded Magdalen College, whose tower you can still see as you enter Oxford. Very beautiful tower. That tower was organised, the finance for it was organised by a young fellow of Magdalen called Thomas Woolsey in the 1490s, and he was the last of these great cardinal ministers. He was then just the bursar of Magdalen, to be a don in those days was not as good as it is today, but then he went to London and ended up as King Henry VIII's chief minister by the 1510s. That's another story. But I've said enough to realise that a lot of the bishops were really maybe honest and hard-working men, but really civil servants who were in orders and were rewarded by beginning a bishopric, but they left the actual work, most of them, not all, left the actual work of being diocesan bishops to their vicar generals. So there wasn't full leadership at the top. When you get to the parish clergy, and remember England was an overwhelmingly rural country, you get a big jump, or a big drop. They were humble, socially and educationally, not much above the peasants whom they served, and they were usually of peasant origin. They hadn't been to university, unlike the higher clergy, but had learnt a bit of Latin and a little scripture on the spot from another priest, just as a craftsman who made saddles or other leather goods would be apprenticed to a master. However, the parish clergy were quite prosperous, even educated by the standards of the peasantry themselves. And if they were moral men, they were probably better as pastoral workers and priests than a highly educated university-trained cleric would be. The really poor were those without livings at all, who had to go around working for other priests, saying mass, for money from now and again, that sort of thing. There were also a large number of hangers-on, often disreputable in the church, whom Chaucer, the 14th century poet, satirises, who were in minor orders, not priests at all, sextons and vergers, doorkeepers, the summoners to the archdeacon's court. The fact that I mention the archdeacon's court shows the power of the church. If you blasphemed or did immoral things like sex before marriage in those days, and if you fathered or had an illegitimate child, depending on your gender, you'd be up before the archdeacon. And certainly for heresy, but just for ordinary crime or ordinary immorality or dissolute lifestyle, and he'd fine you or even imprison you. Then, of course, we come to the regular clergy, the monks and nuns. They were rich at this time. Their monasteries had usually been there by now for 500 years, maybe longer, since Anglo-Saxon times. They'd collected a lot of land and buildings and money, and they'd usually neglected their simple austere rule, which said that they should work and have a rather uncomfortable time physically, but pray. Chaucer takes this off in the 1380s with his monk, who's really a prior, who is really a country gentleman who happens to be a monk. Not a bad man, but not our idea of a monk. The prior likes hunting, stuffing himself with goose, wearing fine clothes, etc. So the monks and nuns at this time were usually not fervent. In contrast to what Henry VIII said, however, or had his lackeys to say in the 1530s, they were not usually debauched either. Henry VIII has a very spicy view of them painted in order to dissolve the monasteries. But they'd lost much of their raison d'etre, to use a French phrase. What were they for anymore around 1500? In this framework, the laity pursued their devotional life. Let me say it seems conventional enough. There's little evidence of heresy, or even of anti-clericalism, heresy that's non-Catholic beliefs, which seems odd when the Reformation is just round the corner, but we'll deal with that another time. Anti-clericalism is simple general criticism of the shortcomings of the clergy, and we know it existed, but if you look at wills and other documents left by the elite, you don't see it in those. Anti-clericalism, by the way, is not heresy. You can be a perfectly good Catholic and still anti-clerical. The rich laity endowed religious institutions, especially the parish churches. They weren't so fond of the monasteries, and this was linked to commemorative masses. They wanted priests to pay for their souls. Intercessory prayers with God. This was very sensible, really, according to Catholic teaching. People believed that after their death they'd spend an awful lot of time in purgatory, and that they might get very brutally punished there by God for their sins. A very hard-headed man thought that, the first Tudor, Henry VIII, who left the equivalent of about £1 million in our currency to pay for 10,000 masses for his soul, because he knew that he'd done a lot of morally disreputable things as a king in order to get and keep his throne. And although he seems a very hard-headed earthly figure, he was obviously very frightened on his deathbed, and tried to buy his way into heaven. Typical Henry takes out his chequebook, or didn't quite have chequebooks, but if he had had one, that's what he'd have done. So the church benefited a great deal from this belief in purgatory, which caused people to endow the clergy and churches on a huge scale. The process is a worldly element. If you give money to a parish church, of course, you're perpetuating your glory after your death and the glory of your family. But nevertheless, the belief in purgatory must have been real. Otherwise, why not raise monuments to your glory in a more secular way? Many laity, especially poor ones who couldn't pay for prayers on their own, joined confraternities, sort of religious organizations, often connected with trade guilds. And these confraternities would themselves pay for prayers and requiem masses and intercessory masses after your death. The role of towns was very important in religious life at this time. As I said, in the country, the parish clergy tended to be not particularly well educated, rather peasant-like themselves, so wealthier and more educated people could find a much more cultivated clergy in the towns. The religious practice of the elite, as you might expect, was more educated, more bookish. Books of devotion, especially after printing came in the 1470s, were produced in English in rather large numbers. Indeed, a Venetian observer talks about the English in London all poring over their books of devotion. But there were limits to this. The elite shared a lot of superstitions, collecting relics with the ordinary peasantry. They went on pilgrimages as well, and the core belief was, of course, remained the same. We might just glance at various movements around 1500. There was the humanist movement, associated with the Dutchman Erasmus, and in England with his friend Thomas More, Bishop Fisher, both of whom had died as martyrs for the Roman Church under Henry VIII. They wanted a deeper and more profound understanding of Catholic teaching, and they wanted to clean up church abuses. They also wanted people to read the New Testament, whether in New Testament Greek, which was now being studied again, or in a good translation. They were not Protestants or heretics, but they were overtaken by the Protestant movement. Then there was anti-clericalism. The humanists were often anti-clerical, but anti-clericalism as such was a general thing. It's a game all the family can play. If you don't need much more equipment than a mouth. You can be intellectual and sophisticated, or you can just be generally critical. If you've ever seen the film made of Thomas More in the 60s, A Man for All Seasons, at the opening, when Wolsey sends a messenger to More's house, More is holding a party, and there's some guy leaning against the mantelpiece who's a bit drunk, and he says, "Ha ha ha! They say half the bastards in England are fathered by a priest." That's just the sort of anti-clerical remark you can make very easily. But there was a lot of criticism of this sort It didn't mean that people were not good Catholics, but they disliked the shortcomings of the Church, its wealth and pride as clergy. There was the native English heresy of Lollardy, which dated from the 14th century, which anticipated some of Protestantism. But Lollardy was confined to the poor by now. The elite adherents had been discouraged in the early 15th century, and mainly wandering poor, craftsmen, pedlars, etc., evangelized certain areas. London, there were Lollards in London, Lollards in the Chilterns in East Anglia. The average sort of fixed, subsistent peasant ploughing arable land with his oxen was not usually a Lollard. But Lollardy existed and came to be absorbed into the Protestant bloodstream later in the 16th century. Then from the 1520s, Lutheranism creeps in. Lutheranism is not a suppressed native heresy. It's not even a set of debating points in Latin. By the end of the 1520s, it's an organised rival church in Germany. And it interests various sorts of English people, including sailors. We don't usually associate sailors going to Germany, to Hamburg, with being particularly religious today, but apparently they were then. Merchants trade into Germany, and there were German merchants in England, the Hanseatic merchants. Intellectuals in Cambridge, the young Thomas Cranmer, and the undergraduate who was to be Elizabeth's first Archbishop, Matthew Parker, Nosy Parker, were all discussing Lutheranism. Nevertheless, its influence belongs to after 1530, even after 1547. It interested people, but it hadn't really reached the masses by 1530. You need the opening of the break with Rome before Protestantism really seeps in. So, a fairly conventional late medieval Catholicism with grumbles then. How England by 1590 transforms into an overwhelmingly Protestant country is quite puzzling, but is another story.